Because it is poems old and new, I thought that I would start with some new poems that are going to be appearing in my forthcoming book, which I think will be out around about June or July. The book's called Storm and Honey, and it's in two sections. I thought I'd read from the second section first, because that's a collection of some miscellaneous poems, and then I'll move on to the other section. And I thought, given the weather today, that it might be appropriate to read a poem called Rain. Rain, bubble wrapping the windows. Rain falling as though someone ran a blade down the spines of fish, setting those tiny backbones free. Rain with its squinting glance, rain with its rustle of descending silk. Rain, rain, the cascading rain, outrunning its own skeins in the lilting dark. The loquacious rain glissading across the drip garrulous leaves. Tipsy rain puddling, wetting its own socks. Rain swirl at my feet, smelling of leaf musk. Rain falling like seed gobs in the streetlight's tumble-down gloom. Sifted rain, purling, paying its way while its veil makes a thin distance. Rain spaccatoing off wavelets in their hilly crests. Rain cashing up along the skyline of gold-minted lights. Rain nibbling at the grass with broken teeth. Crestfallen rain leaving the road, then rifling through the lop-eared treetops. Rain tangle-footed, half out of its clothes. Sweeps of rain like hair, like pampas stalks, wind-tarried, bending, or tall, ornamental, moving loosely and skew-whiff. Rain's drops when they begin to fly as though they're being shuttered off a shaggy dog. Rain, way-worn in the slippery night, drumbling across awnings, gutters, windows, walls, and slowing down those titterby drops until the sky, like a new god, glozes with a little rollicking thunder and lets the first light through in luteous gloops. But then more rain, more clouds stacking up, rain that will come down fast again, like grain from gunny sacks. The next poem was suggested to me after I read a poem by the American poet David St. John, and he had a line in one of his poems which was, I have always loved the word guitar. And my poem's called Appaloosa. I have never been bumped in a saddle as a horse springs from one diagonal to another. A two-beat gait light and balanced as the 4 beats per stride become the hair-blowing, wind-in-the-face, grass-rippling, muscle-loosening, forward-leaning exhilaration of the gallop. And I have never counted the slow 4-beat pace of distinct, successive hoofbeats in such an order as to be called the walk, or learned capriole, piaffe, croupade in a riding school, nor heard the lingo of outback cattle cutters spat out with their whip ends and phlegm. I have never stepped my hands over the flanks of a spotted mare, or ridden a Cleveland Bay carriage horse, or a Yorkshire coach horse, a French Percheron with its musical snicker, or a little Connemara, its face buried in broom corn or in a bin of Wexford apples. I have never called a horse Dancer, Seabiscuit, Ned, Nellie, Trigger or Chester, or made clicking noises with my tongue during the 50 kilometres to town with a balking gelding and a green quarter-top buggy, nor stood in a field while an old nag worked every acre, only stopping to release difficult knobs of manure and swat flies with her tail. And though I have waited for jockeys at the backs of stables in the mist and rain, for the soft feel of their riding silks and saddles, for the cool smoke of their growth-stunting cigarettes, for the names of the yearlings and mares they whisper, along with the names of horse-owning millionaires, more even than them, I have always loved the word Appaloosa. The next poem is the shortest poem I've ever written. It's 8 lines long. It's just called Boats in Distress. I see them in the water-drunken waves, the prows, the decks, the ropes, heavy, heavy, where the breakers reach the rocks. Sails, torn feathers, under the pauper witness of the sky. Though sometimes one will appear, a lamplight out of the gust, calmly listing her way across the weather like a middle-aged bride. Two bird poems next. The first one is about those very, very noisy birds that often wake people up to their annoyance in the morning, the cockatoos. You're slamming your voices again around the reverberating heat, making the sky scritch like an LP being backtracked under the groove-wrecking fingers of a house-partying DJ. I long to hear you just crick seeds from the pine cones, or forage in consenting grasses, or take flight down passageways of the wind. Perhaps later you'll sit under the sun and listen quietly to breezes in the blue gums turning the leaves around, sounding as though they were coming in from the sea. O lawless felons, since dawn you've been loud hailing your news from the sky's bloody underbelly. You're determined to make us hear trenching tools trench the iron day, a queue of people hawk up phlegm, a wrecking ball swing hard against tin. You're swooping, calling, as if cement were being scraped, gravel shovelled, as if you were pulley shifting trunks and branches into corrupted backlots, calling as though you were ransacking crates full of iron burrs or raking through an underworld of crowbars, files and tire irons. Not a flock, but a syndicate, and ready to tear up our sky with the scattershot narrative of hard-hatted men. Now to one of my favourite birds, which are the water birds. This one's called Herons at Dusk. And this one's in 5 four-line stanzas. This is a time of day when the light runs down the sky like bluing and meets the bay, when whipbirds set acoustic flares along the trees, when I'll stand and listen to the yachts, a sound of his cutlery were being replenished on tabletops. But most of all, when I love to watch the herons step along the shore, how like Tai Chi performers they will step deftly, easily, into constantly reconfigured stances. I can see one down by the mangroves now, moving and then redoing each step, as though it has become fastidious about how to present the curve of its neck, a punctilio it must get right before it will allow itself to stand twin to its reflection. Near the pier, another heron is holding its bill over the reeds, as purposeful as a seiner with a marlin spike, before it jabs, then returns to its wire-drawn stance, as if all it must achieve now is to lift and pull itself into the distance like sail twine. When the herons quietly step, they make even the stilts and avocets neat stabs along the sand seem like slapstick. They make the routines of all who fish along the shore at dusk seem overweighted and vaudevillian. And look how they stand at last, stilled to perfection. We were having a conversation at lunch about certain creatures, and Les was saying one of the creatures he could do without is the mosquito. And I think most of us would agree. So this is my complaint to the mosquito. It's called The Mosquito Riffs and Plaints. And I do have to apologise to Les because I've actually pinched one of his phrases. The last 2 words in the poem are a phrase from Les's poem, Morse, poem about Morse code. So the mosquito riffs and plaints. I prefer the cicada's stroboscopic, glitzy, oral brandishings, and the bee's legato burr. Even the blowflies whir when heat keeps the pedal down. The cockatoo's pulley-driven clangs of wrecking ball metal against a sky amplified. The wind as it knocks and turns and turns into ruin the slow, percussive refrain of the moody midday rain. I prefer the digestive grumblings of an eructing city drain, a frog's slow glugs, bats' incessant chitter, the crickets like house slaves singing, even pigeons under the eaves doing an all-day funked-out coo. I prefer the damaged ringing of my inner ear, and yes, say it, everything turning tintinnabular, than to hear this stylus-burdened insect pest mimicking a tiny current's hum and hiss, this long-nosed diva floating above my breath. Plump criminal, you idle above the cool pleasure of my skin. You hitch up your mouthparts, plot crimes above my pulse, steal from my cast of good deep red. Look, I know what you courier, and it isn't quinine. I know how you lie in gully traps, in pit latrines, at the edges of clear running streams. You love the horse trough, the water butt, puddles in unmade roads, brick pits, barrow pits. You love the dregs in rusted tins. Little aching creature, stuttering to the night like a tiny violin. You look like one of Liszt's hemi, demi, semiquavers crawled across night's long stave. With you I count insomnia's digits. All your mal arias are buzzing in my blood. I prefer a storm's drumfire scud, an afternoon's cloud of slow, distempered midges, all the sizzling obituaries of fruit flies above a compost, the loudest of Frank Zappa's riffs zapping anything but noise flying through my head. Mosquito, you sing into my ear as if it were your mosque, but I'm waiting for you with my aerosols around the back end of spring. I'm waiting, Mosquito, for my hand to slap a message back, just once, loudly and quick as your electric dialect. I'll change a bit of tack now and read some poems from the first section of the book, which are a series of 30 dramatic monologues written from the point of view of a young fisherman who's part of a team of 2 other fishermen. He's slightly younger and a little bit more naive. And this poem I wrote after I read something. It was an amazing account of a whale being hauled by trailer to a research station in Taiwan. The whale, of course, had died, and all the gases had started to build up inside it, and it was getting to the point where it did actually explode in the middle of the street there. So I kind of used that idea and transposed it onto these characters, onto a different scene entirely. It's called Whale. And the fisherman, the speaker of the poem, there's also Grennan is one of the other fishermen and Davy is the other one. Grennan makes some incisions into the intestinal wall. An awful smell comes out. We swear, turn our heads away. The hiss of the gas escaping sounds as though a whole convoy of trucks were suddenly pumping down on their pneumatic brakes. It washed ashore 6 days ago. Everyone said that a build-up of gases might make it explode. We rope the carcass, ready to tow it where we know there's an old whale fall. Davy says the beast looks almost as big as the Hindenburg blimp. We move out, bumping over the breakers. Soon the carcass starts to cannonade like a backfiring lorry. Then maggots, white as sea spray, stream out. The stiff easterly keeps blowing them into our eyes and mouths, along with the terrible stink. Davy and I stagger, turning nauseous under the sky's wide, emptying plate. We can't say what's worse, being covered in bits of exploded whale or these writhing maggots. Grennan keeps steering, making for the horizon. Finally, we dump it, amazed at how long it takes for bubbles to stop rising. Another rather gruesome one. The subject matter of some of these poems is a little brutal and nasty, I must admit. This one's called Octopus. I look up towards the headland at the lighthouse. Frigate hawks are blowing down in dusky scraps. In the distance, I can hear a blowhole throwing the spray of a shattered wave into the air. the sea hissing like a bandwidth of mistuned frequencies. I climb towards the headland. Sand stings my legs as if a volley of pins were being spat from a pea shooter. The tide, with its smell of salt and dreck, is already receding. When I reach the headland, I stand and watch gannets fight for purchase on the lighthouse that looks for a moment like a statue of a headless pope. Not long ago, I dropped a whole load of cod, brill and black skimmer brim down the gap between the pier and the hull. Already I think I can hear Grennan's voice in grey salt threshing in the shallows, addressing the flies, myself and the sea lice in a tone only a ruined and ruthless fisherman would weigh in from a raw and unforgiving sea. I sit for a while in the spume of the salt until the wind like a taut rope holds me. When I come down, the wind has dropped. Bluebottles are washing up on the sand. It is quieter now, only the waves roaring then flattening into a monotone as grim as the rumble of a carburettor living on poor gas. In the west, clouds are hanging oddly above the range, cast iron blocks whose hoist chains might snap. Rain is fretting again from the gouty end of the sky. Ahead on the pier, I can see Grennan hauling up an octopus, its arms flailing about the way rubber does when it's stripping off a blowing tyre. Some ink shoots out like dark, hot propellant just as he gets his knife into it. I feel suddenly cold, cold as something laid out on a fishmonger's slab. There's a few characters in the first section of the book, and they're all made up. I very rarely write out of my own sort of direct experience. I like to just imagine scenarios and characters and situations. I find using my own personal life rather tedious to write about, but I do like, inventing characters and scenarios. So this is about a particular fellow that I imagined. His name's Delancey. He lived in a shack on Bennett's Creek. The mudflats were black and always stank. He said it was because they were full of bacteria that stripped the oxygen from the sulfate compounds and gave off toxic gas. But it was a beautiful place. The crabs would come out onto the silt at low tide and feed like a regiment. You could hear the flacker of the ducks as they took off through the mangroves, those roots you thought might almost begin to smoke. We'd sit and watch the crabs or mend some nets, or he'd rub away at a spark plug, yellow as a dugon's tooth, or we'd watch the stars come on, close as town lights. I liked his manner, the way his expression would inexplicably change, the way he'd turn his head this way and that, as though before he spoke he was trying each thought like a key. He told me once he thought the moon was as beautiful as a find of Turkish meerschaum. Eventually he left. Kids burnt down his shack one night, stalking the derelict track. We saw those flames from as far away as the wharf. I never went back to the creek, but I think often of how we'd listened to the crabs sucking out their mousse from the mud. I can still see him walking across the marsh flats, fervently stropping his hands through a mist of mosquitoes and gnats to reach me in our spot by the fallen logs. Delancey had told me that the creek wasn't the place to get answers, but that it would give me questions as fine as the sediment burrowed from the mud by the yabbies and crabs. Sometimes I catch myself shaking my head the way he did, just working it slowly like a sieve at the water's edge. I really like writing about thunderstorms, mainly because I like watching them, of course from the safety of a house or a room, but they are spectacular things. This one's called The Point. A thunderhead, like an enormous decaying molar, lightning shooting as quickly as cracked pane. I row across the inlet just going on my nerve, but when I come round the point, the light I enter seems smoothed to a varnish by the gleam of the tide. An egret is attending one of the shore pools. Dusk is spreading across the sky like a peach preserve. Still I draw harder on the oars. I hear my rowlocks chirk like a pair of squabbling birds. A scrim of pink has slipped down the headland and is lighting the tops of the dunes. Stilts are stepping out on legs as accurate as needles, keeping perpetuity of the north. It could not be quieter now, not anywhere. I realise that for the last few minutes I've been bruiting what has already passed. The storm, the rough and roiling heavy seas. So I dropped the oars, mystified as to why part of me wanted to be back around the point, keeping the wrong course. And just one or two to finish off now. Again, just continuing with the Fisherman series. This one's called Despite, because it begins with despite and I didn't know what else to call it. Despite a headache, stationary all day, unable to decay, despite these reels ticking again into the gradient of each throb, my eyes feeling as fragile as snow domes in the hands of a fractious child, my head grading all the grains of sand shunted southwards again by a week of black katabatic winds, despite the yachts tinkling, calling like knives on goblets for silence as the tide dumps another load of kelp around my head, I feel happy, calm. And for a moment, I love the feel of Hessian weather on my arms and legs. I love being with Davy, who smells like an old fish trough, stubble on his chin, sharp as wrasses' teeth. I love the lighthouse on the cliff top as it holds the stupefied position of a pocket chess piece. I know another distress flare might soon find its passage through my nerves, my head manipulates, that an onshore of jagged air push isobars back, that lightning's filamented pulse rig more cordage for my head. I know the veins in my head will tighten, distort, bend again like lines trying to dislodge a snag, that nausea will head for a dry berth in my throat. But now I fix my bait, spit out my beer as if it had become as tasteless as the brackish Baltic, and I reel my line in. I know the creels must come in, despite blood on the charts, the pounding of cruel encephalitic winds. I drag the rod back. It arcs like a dolphin scudding on its tail. And I'm happy, calm, fishing here with Davy. We're almost doing the limbo, bringing our lines in. And just to finish off now, and again, I do apologise, it is a rather gruesome subject. It's called The Shark. We heard the creaking clutch of the crank as they drew it up by cable and wheel and hung it sleek as a hull from the roof. Grennan jammed open the great jaws and we saw how the upper jaw hung from the skull. We flinched at the stench of blood that dripped on the fish house floor, and even Davy, when Grennan reached in past the scowl and the steel prop for the stump, just about passed out. The limbs' skin had already blanched, a sight none of us could stomach, and we retched, though Grennan cool began cutting off the flesh in knots, slashing off the flesh in strips. And then Davy, flensing and flanching, opened up the stomach and the steaming bowels. Gulls circled like ghouls. Still they taunt us with their cries, and our hearts still burn inside us when we remember how Grennan, with a tool, took out what was left of the child. Thank you very much.